Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention? Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Martin Procházka. I'm the convener of the Congress. And I would like to welcome you in this, I would say, historical building of the Karolinum. Charles University was founded in 1348, so more than 600 years ago. And this is, of course, an extension which was already built in the Baroque style. The original house and the original hall was Gothic, and you will see it after the lecture. I apologize, but this couldn't be prevented because we had 2 years of the pandemic. And so the Congress had to be postponed from 2020 until today. We are glad that we can finally meet, at least with some of you, in person. And I would like to welcome all who are watching this online. The Congress, as you can see, takes place in a hybrid way, and this session is being streamed. Those who cannot watch it because of the local time difference will be able to download the recording. And I hope that our first keynote lecture will be able to answer their questions via email, for instance. Let me start with thanks. First, for the great support of the former and present chairs of our association, Murray, Caroline McCracken-Flesher, and Carla, of course. Then to the members of the Congress and ISSL Steering Committee, and also to our sponsors, especially to the Research, Development and Innovation Project CREAS, funded by the European Union, and most importantly, to my dear colleague and the Congress manager, Petra Poncarová, whom already you know from the correspondence, and some of you also from conferences, and to the student assistants, whom you will see tomorrow. Prague has not been chosen as this Congress venue by chance. There is a long tradition of cultural and political relations between the Czechs and the Scots. Both nations were rather reluctantly incorporated into major European empires. 400 years ago, Scottish officers, Sir John Seton of Karolinum and Henry Bruce, efficiently defended Czech and Moravian cities against the Austrian Imperial Army, while Sir Andrew Grey collected an army of 2,500 men to help the Czechs against the Austrian invasion. The cultural relations started to flourish in the 19th and 20th centuries. Important was the influence of the Ossian poems and the translations of Robert Burns and Robert Louis Stevenson. In the 20th century, Edwin and Willa Muir visited Prague twice. They met the leading Czech writer Karel Čapek, and Willa produced the first translations of Franz Kafka into English. All this is documented by an exhibition on Czech and Scottish relations, prepared by Petra, which will be opened on Friday, and we, of course, will welcome you there at the opening. Scottish studies have been developing at Charles University since the beginning of this century, under the support from the universities of Glasgow, Edinburgh, St Andrews, and more recently, the College Salmore Ostay. Thanks to the last mentioned institution, we have also started the research of Gallic literature, pursued by Petra Poncarová, who is also a successful teacher of and translator from Gallic. She also intensely cooperates with our colleagues in Irish studies, and I would like to welcome the chair of ISIL, Ondřej Pilný. Let me finish by wishing you a pleasant stay in Prague. I now gladly give the floor over to Petra.
Thank you so much, Martin, for such a generous introduction and the welcome. Agus anish feskrama acharchen, hashin ule anavarachtoliche, guvelshin akonechek aunam Prague, mujerek haul, agus guvel koromakin falche achur orth ule, she uram ahaun agus she tlach ahaun. Hošich planichen erson na kolavrščo aunam Prague, aunam Daviles šachčiek, agus vašin aunam Vancouver, aunam Canada, agus hamihast aunam Brešli, guvelšiv ule ančo, as je koik bliana, agus na dálechien ava do jachinče, agus na tribličen aha ereviaun marahafis akin ule. Anturascho, reinchin argichel, gusambi barakveperenaun, agus orichin, ansafrogram kusperen kochialche, rishagalik, agus hamian dulgundo horovichshin guire koju. Vekanas anamiche, bishin a kruinchin bardach, aunan alabish, agus aunan galik, wo da waard le, aha via furuch, agus askrivek, aunam mian na ronjorpa, agus sulime guvilshin mirvalach, agus gleimechi. Maha rutsambi a I orov, maha shiv femech rutsambi, jirach inshivhov, njodochuchikin ele ansanski pakin. Hamiando chas gumbishin ule erardoi, gumbi jo sporsaun agus jo chorak adol, agus gumbi planichen agus proschechten ura atoshechek, s arisht mile tank ersonchin. So, welcome. That was my opening bit in Gaelic. We are delighted to have you all here. And now it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Dr. Eva Lehečková, who is going to welcome you on behalf of the institution. We are overjoyed that she was able to join us tonight. And she has also been very active in the support of minority languages at the faculty. So, please.
Dear colleagues, it is a great honor for me as Dean of the Faculty of Arts of Charles University to be present at the opening of this international congress. I believe that after 2 years of the pandemic, it is a sheer joy for you to be able to meet again in person for convivial debates on your research topics. I don't want to deprive you of the main purpose of this gathering for too long. I would only like to make 2 brief remarks in the context of which I feel keenly about the conference we are opening today. Both the Faculty of Arts and Charles University list the promotion of internationalization and international research cooperation as one of their priorities in their strategic documents. I am pleased to see that for more and more scientific fields cultivated at our faculty, this is not just a priority on paper, but a lived experience. For instance, at the beginning of the summer holidays, we will have the honor of welcoming the world's largest Congress of Tibetan Studies, with over 600 participants, alongside 2 smaller international conferences in the field of Latin studies. The World Phonetic Congress in 2023 and the International Conference of Child Language a year later, to mention just the biggest ones. It is natural that many such conferences, including yours, touch on various world languages and their literatures and cultures, because we see this as one of the profile fields of the Faculty of Arts. Our endeavor is to promote both degree and non-degree studies in as many languages as possible, because we strongly believe that multilingualism is healing and monolingualism is curable. Thank you. At the same time, we have at heart the protection of endangered and oppressed languages, and the promotion of the translation and translators of belles lettres and into languages regardless of number of speakers. To meet this goal, In 2018, we established the Library of Languages popularization platform at the Faculty of Arts, which organizes lectures, workshops, and gamified learning activities for students, teachers, and the general public. I believe that these principles and goals of our faculty resonate with the themes of your conference and add further reasons for holding this conference at the Faculty of Arts. Dear colleagues, in closing, let me thank my faculty colleagues, my colleagues at the Department of Anglophone Literatures and Cultures for taking on the challenging role of local organizers and for their dedication to the preparation of the Congress, both in its official and unofficial parts. I wish you all to take away from Prague many refreshing experiences and inspirational suggestions for future work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lehečková, for such a great welcome, with so many inspiring thoughts. And the last welcome address is going to be delivered by Professor Carla Sassi, who, as you all know, is the current convener of the International Association for the Study of Scottish Literatures, which is the body behind this Congress.
Dobré odpoledne a vítejte v Praze, which was not a perfect pronunciation. I haven't practiced long enough. Good afternoon and welcome to Prague. It is an immense honor and joy to welcome you to the third World Congress of the International Association for the Study of Scottish Literatures, held in presence, but also partly virtually, as this opening event is being live streamed. So a hearty welcome again to all members and friends near and far. The World Congress is no doubt the central and defining moment in the life of our association. Those of us who attended the first Congress held in Glasgow in 2014, marking the launch of IASL, had the privilege of witnessing the first truly international gathering of Scotlit scholars. It was a changing moment in the life of our disciplinary field, both in terms of a new opportunity of meeting colleagues and seeing old friends and acquaintances, but also in terms of awareness of how much the interest in Scottish studies had grown and developed across so many countries. The second Congress, held in Vancouver in 2017, focusing on dialogues and diasporas, offered a further memorable opportunity to expand our disciplinary boundaries and to consider colonial and post-colonial cross-cultural exchange as more crucial than ever to our collective understanding of Scottish literatures. Since 2014, our association has steadily grown in size and ambition, more than doubling its members, with colleagues joining from North and South America, Asia, Australasia, and many European countries, and also launching new initiatives, from the Jack Prize, now Jack Medal, honoring the extraordinary work and legacy of a scholar who conceived Scottish literature as a site of cross-cultural exchange and encounter across borders, to the launch of smaller regional conferences. The first was held in Hawaii in 2018. From the various online initiatives, podcast interviews with our members, and webinars during the pandemics to keep alive exchange and communication in that difficult period, to the recent revision of our constitution designed to respond to the growing and changing needs of our community. And we are especially proud to have introduced IASL's first PhD advisory board. Our wonderful reps, Kayu Ehe, Mike Edinger, and Roslyn Potter, are all here in Prague and have already launched a series of initiatives. This is also a good opportunity to remember the excellent work of the two former conveners, Mary Pittock, also the founder of IASL, and Caroline McCracken-Flesher, and of their respective committees. And thanks also to the current committee that I have the privilege to work with and that has now completed its second year and 2 years. We will step down in May 2023 to leave room to a new team who will carry on our work and no doubt lead IASL to many more success stories. Among these, the 4th World Congress, date and location will be revealed during the business meeting by the organizers themselves, so that is certainly an extra reason to attend it. While IASLA's mission is unique, insofar as we are the only Scottish Studies Association with a specifically global agenda, we work within a constellation of sister associations and centres of studies. First and foremost, the Association for Scottish Literature, also like us, based in Glasgow. And then I would like to remember in random order and with no claim to exhaustiveness, the French Society for Scottish Studies, Scotland in Europe, based in Poland, the Scottish Studies Centres at the University of Nanjing in China, Bankura in India, Guelph in Canada, South Carolina in the US, Mainz in Germany. And of course, the outstanding team of colleagues here in Prague. So what a joy it is to be here in Prague today, at long last, with the prospect before us of a superb congress organized impeccably by a wonderful team led by Professor Martin Procházka and Dr. Petra Poncarová, to whom goes our deepest gratitude for their professionalism and patience in accommodating shifting deadlines and overcoming the many challenges that these past 2 years have posed. It is great to see included in the program many established colleagues, the stars of the Scotlit firmament, but also many younger scholars and PhD students. And in general, it is great to witness the growing number of students from across the world, many in non-Anglophone countries, engaging in this field of studies with passion and stunning results. And also, how marvelous to be able to travel, to see and meet colleagues again, for all the wonderful opportunities offered by technology, which we have all plenty of time to explore and appreciate. We have all missed this being together, the conviviality that is so central in the making and sharing of knowledge. And finally, what a joy to be here at the very heart of Europe, at the heart of one of the many small countries that make Europe, the Europe that we love, the Europe that protects and nurtures its cultural diversity, its many languages and dialects. It was indeed Europe that adopted the Charter for Regional or Minority Languages in 1992 to protect and promote its historical regional and minority languages, including Scots and Scottish Gaelic. We're all citizens of this world, but I hope you will agree with me when I say that Scotland is very much at home here. In many ways, that is where it truly belongs. And it was, after all, none other than Scottish novelist and polymath Alistair Gray, who in his 1997 pamphlet, Why Scots Should Rule Scotland, who said something along similar lines, comparing his country to a wealth of other thriving, interesting and enterprising small European nations. Why can't we be like Denmark or Latvia or Finland, he asked. Indeed, why not? And then we should also bear in mind that small is never really small when it comes to countries. That was Scottish poet, essayist and activist Hugh MacDermid's lesson, Scotland small, our multiform, our infinite Scotland small, he flamboyantly and argumentatively asked. The lesson surely must apply to any small country in Europe and beyond. Scotland and the Czech Republic are certainly small in terms of territory, minuscule even, but they're not so in terms of cultural and linguistic complexity. As a matter of fact, they both have produced an extraordinary legacy of literature, sciences, arts, and music. In Orcadian poet and translator Edwin Muir's autobiography, 1954, Prague takes up a whole chapter. Here, Muir and his wife Willa, also a writer and a translator, had spent several months between 1921 and 1922. The pages where he describes the place, its architecture and colors, where he conveys his admiration for the extraordinary richness of its history and culture, and for the warmth and the independence of the people he met here, sparkle with enthusiasm, but also disclose a sense of subtle kinship for a country that had achieved in his own eyes what his own has yet to achieve. On this note of explorative desire, curiosity, and kinship, thank you very much again, and have a great Congress.
Thank you very much, Carla. And we are delighted that the opening ceremony of this Congress, which focuses on Scottish literatures, is going to be concluded in a most fitting manner by a poetry reading in Scots and in Gaelic. And it is absolutely fascinating and very appropriate that we have with us two contemporary and much acclaimed Scottish poets, Matthew Fitt and Christopher Whyte, who have both been based in Central Europe for a number of years, and thus they, in a way, embody this European dimension of Scottish literature. We are going to hear from Matthew first, and then from Christopher, and please join them in giving them a very warm welcome.
Dobrý večer, dámy a pánové. Jmenuji se Matthew Fitt, básník a spisovatel. Je velká čest být součástí třetího světového kongresu skotské literatury nebo skotských literatur. Okay. Good afternoon, I'm Matthew Fitt, maker and skriver. Friends, neighbours, ken speckle folk of Scottish literature has brought us everybody here together after a long time. Michael Mara, the late singer-songwriter, once stayed in the Žižkov area of Prague. Žižkov is famously free-spirited and independently minded part of this city. Michael told me that he felt at home here, that Žižkov was remarkably similar to the area of Dundee where Michael was born and raised, that area being Lochee. In fact, he said to me with a girly, humane conviction that he said everything, Matthew, Žižkov is Prague's Lochee. This is my tribute to Michael's unique way of seeing the world. As we welcome all of you to Prague, I imagine him meeting up with all the spirits of other Scots and Scotophiles, many of them mentioned already, that have stayed here through the centuries in this city, to the approximate tune of Michael's much-loved song, If Dundee Was Africa. Michael Mara's visit to Prague. Lang syne in Bohemia, fae old Caledonia, that place called Dundonia. This sangster man came, and he danced with the Winter Queen, and Mucha's last Geraldine, met Edmund Muir doon at Joffin, crossed swords with James Graham, and he flew round Moravia in a Skoda Octavia, scored 2 goals for John Madden Slavia, and then he went home to his friend's house in Žižkov, which is nowhere near Mishkov, crossed the river fae Smichov, Žižkov of illustrious fame. And Michael said that anyone would agree that Žižkov is Prague's Lochee, lang syne in Bohemia, fae old Caledonia, that place called Dundonia, the sangster man came. Fae Scots migrating to the Czech Republic, a turn now to Czechs that over the years have flitted and made Scotland their home. The Czechs in Scotland, bringing their resilience, their ingenuity, their grace under pressure, have done nothing but improve the place. The best of them, in my opinion, is my wife. She stayed in Lanarkshire for a wheen one of her years and illumined the Peely-Willy climate with her presence, her beautiful painting of Clydesdale, and the impossibly tall sunflowers that she grew every year without fail on the banks of the River Clyde. Mirka's sunflowers. She arrived for the land of which we ken nothing, and brocht the Dork Island in adrenaline of yellows. La Jolla's Spanish lights flicker in her een. Her skin has the thaw of Baja California, and under her fingernails, Mojave Desert Stour. In a knapsack pocket, she carries Trotsky's Ochre Seas, a Kanga wrap that ends blad like a pirate sailor or Ipanema, paper pokes fu a Xanthan gathered through the parks of Hint 5 Dugs. And in the season, her sunflowers glister like memories, renew the pigments of vanishing afternoons, and continue to renew in this nation of Imas licht, where we ride the rape highway for Kinfons to Kerry to the sulphurous city of Yount, and observe between summers the winter sun, forever crash landing on Tinto. Děkuji vám, Morantang. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And now we'll be hearing from Christopher in Scottish Gaelic.
I'm going to read two poems. When I was a teenager, there was a book in circulation by Germaine Greer called The Female Eunuch, pretty out of date by now. And I remember on the cover there was a woman's torso, chopped off at the arms and the neck and the thighs, and it looked a bit like a body and a bit like a garment. And for some reason, this image became very connected for me with the concept of the soul. The soul plays a part in this poem too, but in a rather different way. I'll read the Gaelic first and then the English. Chanje páiste a hasan anam. Is dol cála rain van chréal gus an tuama. Torst fianish, bergachug. Fólang kutchuch magutje. Is klarachug na heer sin fólangus nos hervis rísh. Le ukas mar gumbaun jo heimel. Gunachkel esantach no breanish. Maar faastje, hadal kaler parent na groichen. Deunen fehe weer moment san kettiger ga toshige gekleich. Fulshige, goevoerigel, gach koerum ingentige weer lish. Nach gaf tukshen gubullig no ra eentje. Ach, han je paastje houden. Moeierig haul, is hij ra atelig, bishin je nog gug meer te groeigentisch, droeitjig geleershin. The soul is not a child, as it accompanies us from the cradle to the grave, bearing witness, observing, maybe suffering too, at the same time registering what we call suffering or success with an expression that seems indifferent, not offering a word of agreement or judgment, like a child accompanying a parent on their business, constantly awaiting the moment when it will be allowed to start playing, revealing patiently all the wondrous concerns it brings along, which cannot be foreseen or understood. But it is not a child. Only when it's too late at the end do we understand how immense its compassion was, how penetrating its gaze. And the second poem, I don't know where the voice in this poem comes from, but it's a voice I like very much. And I realized when I'd written it that it connects with the very first sequence of poems I wrote in Gaelic in 1987. It's a bit embarrassing to find yourself back in the same place with the idea, I think, of pre-existence coming originally from somewhere else. Ga roerie forestiga vi bja. Ha koltes G voyages en lauerst. Hoeke gans laantje agus colin graagver. Acne year is grats en joensig. Na googna gegurget is koerse behe boogig oil, paaltjes ganen. Ach zijn tjouwelig van no roekig mi, wa burpes kroetelig nan klessig gachke. Raak shaw aunum kruiv e chaies haast mochaal. Smi schaultien le mui meer na dunje, maar joenster mutschen as een boerenjuk kjol verharring, nach buli ach faram. Vashiv kjaarst, garomi kolte grijf. Baun de hoofdshin nach romi gaaielach gumaul ridriach na dunjelig, sna deunig. Or hoor mi marig aan een aatje ele. I have never found it easy being alive. The statement has a touch of ingratitude. I got health and an attractive body, a piercing intelligence, quick to learn, the money I needed, a successful, interesting career, and an abundance of languages. But in the family where I was born, savagery and cruelty were a sort of game. That left a worm in me that is still gnawing at my guts. I look on people with panic as instruments from which it would be possible to draw perfect music that produce only noise. You were right. I was not the same as you. That explains why it took me so long to accept the task of being a man and being human, for I got my education somewhere else. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christopher, and thank you again, Matthew. I think this was really an amazing way to conclude the opening ceremony. Thank you to all our speakers for their words of welcome. And now I'll be passing on to Martin Procházka, who's going to chair the first keynote lecture.
So, ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention again? I feel really greatly honored to introduce Professor Angela Esterhamer. I met her 20 years ago, perhaps, at a conference in Regensburg in Germany. And I know her, of course, as a leading scholar, not only, I would say, in British Romanticism, but in German Romanticism and in the theory of performatives and many other branches, right? Now, Professor Esterhamer is the principal of the Victoria College, University of Toronto. She is a professor at the Department of English of that university and affiliated with the Center of Comparative Literature and the collaborative program in book history and print culture, and last but not least, the Department of German, University of Toronto, St. George. She is among the leading scholars in, as I have said, British, German, and European Romanticism and 19th century culture. The theoretical basis of her research is the theory of verbal performativity and other philosophies of language. Among her 15 books, Creating States, 1994, and The Romantic Performatives may be said to have established and developed the theory of performativity in the framework of Romantic studies. I think that she was the first to introduce theory of performativity into Romantic studies. Another important book, Romanticism and Improvisation, 1750-1850, highlights the popularity of improvisation in European pre-Romantic and Romantic art and the closeness of literary and onstage improvisation. The most important contribution of this book is the discovery of a significant influence of improvisation on the Romantic notions of genius, spontaneity, and orality, as well as on gender and national identities. That's the most interesting, at least for me. Her latest book, Print and Performance in the 1820s, Improvisation, Speculation, and Identity, published in 2020, is a pioneering attempt in Romantic studies to synthesize the research of performativity, intermediality, and the history of print culture. Angela's major contribution to the Scottish studies is the international 15-volume edition of the works of John Galt. She is the founding member and executive committee member of the North American Society for the Study of Romanticism, NASSR, the founding director of Western University's graduate program in comparative literature, and the University of Zurich's PhD program in English and American Literary Studies. She was the president of the Canadian Comparative Literature Association, the distinguished professor at Western University, the recipient of Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship and the Polanyi Prize for Literature. She is a member of the Academia Europaea and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. So join me in welcoming Angela Esterhamer as the first keynote at this Congress.
Hello, everyone. Martin, thank you for that incredibly generous introduction. And thank you to Martin, Petra, and the rest of the organizing committee for the invitation to speak to you this evening, and for persevering against great odds to hold this Congress in person. I'm just delighted to be in Prague, and I'm especially honored and a bit overwhelmed to be giving the opening lecture in this beautiful and historic space. Well, I have been trying hard to find a small silver lining in the unavoidable 2-year delay of what was supposed to be the 2020 Congress, and here it is. Several of the texts and events that I'm talking about tonight date from 1822. So had I been giving this paper 2 years ago, I would have been saying, "'Tis 202 years since," which is slightly awkward. Now, instead, we've arrived at the 200th anniversary of these texts and events, so I'll be highlighting a few of them in my paper tonight. So, to begin, 200 years ago, in 1822, Britain was caught up in a climate of economic speculation and a strong sense of its global interconnectedness. The mobility of people, goods, and texts took many forms: large-scale emigration to the colonies, complicated trading agreements and disputes, and the movement of tourists and expatriates across a European continent that was newly accessible after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Scottish writing of the early 19th century was caught up in these movements. It was enlisted, on the one hand, to boost real-world speculative ventures and encourage international mobility. On the other hand, it was used to process real-world uncertainty and contingency with the help of fictional plot structures and the norms of poetic genre. These patterns are evident in the types of writing that proliferated during the 1820s and 1830s, which hybridized fact and fiction in distinctive ways. In today's talk, I'll examine how speculation and displacement shaped the transatlantic ventures and adventures of early 19th century Scots, as well as their literary productions. The decade of the 1820s was in many ways one of speculation, meaning a time when visual, cognitive, philosophical, and economic meanings of that term proliferated and merged into one another. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the word speculation had only recently acquired its now dominant financial meaning of, quote, engagement in any business enterprise or transaction of a venturesome or risky nature, but offering the chance of great or unusual gain. This form of financial behavior characterized the British markets in the first half of the 1820s, which saw manic investment in new and risky enterprises, including canal, railroad, and resource extraction schemes, and foreign government bonds, with a strong focus on South and Central America. The mania turned to panic and economic collapse at mid-decade. An event regarded by, settlement ventures and publishing houses alike fell victim to the ensuing crash of 1825 to 26, an event regarded by modern historians as causing a fundamental change in economic systems. The overloaded concept of speculation shows up in the form of thematic and plot motifs in Scottish fiction of the early 1820s. St. Ronan's Well, Walter Scott's only novel set in his own times, explores a variety of risky behaviors, including gambling, land speculation, marriage market speculation, and fraud. John Galt's most accomplished novel, The Entail, thematizes land speculation in a different way as the protagonist, Claude Walkinshaw, tries to reassemble the lands in the vicinity of Glasgow that once belonged to his forefathers and entail them on one of his sons. This novel also introduces a motif that will recur in 19th century Scottish discourse about speculation and emigration, that is, recollection of the Darien expedition of 1698 to 99, which sought to establish a Scottish colony and trading empire on the Isthmus of Panama, but ended in disaster, leaving the great majority of the 3,000 colonists dead and depleting Scotland of the vast amount of capital that had been invested in the project. In Galt's Entail, Darien provides the backstory and the motivation for Claude Walkinshaw's ruinous quest. His grandfather, we are told in the novel's opening sentences, liquidated the family lands to speculate on Darien, and Claude's father sailed there as a colonist but never returned, causing his mother to die of grief as well. Leaving Claude a landless orphan, the Darien speculation is the first cause of his obsession to reunify the ancestral lands at the cost of his own family. In these examples, speculation appears primarily as a plot element, but I want to suggest that speculation also manifests as a mode of writing during the 1820s. In other words, there's a homology between the relationship of fact to imaginative projection in financial enterprise and the same relationship in literary fiction. Ian Bauckham, in Spectres of the Atlantic, Finance, Capital, Slavery, and the Philosophy of History, posits a negative version of this homology between financial systems and literary fiction when he argues that the speculative epistemology that sustained slavery and exploitation was founded on the abstract thinking about people and events made possible by 18th century novels. For Bauckham, that is, a mode of novelistic writing informs harmful speculative thinking and behavior in the real world. Conversely, under the more local conditions of the early 1820s, when literature was intensely reactive to the marketplace, I suggest that literary forms mirror economic behavior. Like speculative financial ventures, speculative writing extrapolates from observable or factual reality to future-oriented projection that is sustained by belief or credit, but vulnerable to contingencies. Real-world financial speculations, that is to say, typically have some basis in material fact, such as the existence of resources, technologies, and means of production, but their perceived value, augmented by collective belief, optimism, and sometimes fantasy, is a fiction that projects beyond the value of actually existing resources. Similarly, speculative fiction, in the sense that I'm using the term to talk about novels of the 1820s, incorporates elements of real-world history or science, thereby appealing to readers to invest their belief in the story, but it veers off from this documentary basis into imaginative fantasy. Two compelling examples of this fictional mode are Scott's Red Gauntlet and Hogg's Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner, both of which appeared in June of 1824, a moment that also marked the height of financial speculation in Britain. In Scott's case, While previous Waverley novels involved their heroes in the actual Jacobite rebellions of 1715 and 1745, Red Gauntlet swerves from the course of 18th century history by postulating a third attempted uprising in the summer of 1765, along with a fictitious return to the Scottish borderlands by the aging Chevalier Charles Edward Stuart from exile on the continent. Scott's other novels typically place fictional characters in historical settings. Red Gauntlet does something different, placing historical figures on an alternate plane of reality. Scott represents the Jacobite cause itself as a speculation, a high-risk enterprise founded on hope and belief rather than on actually existing conditions. The would-be rebellion led by Hugh Red Gauntlet, a Stuart sympathizer who spends his life, quote, altogether engaged in political speculations, turns out to be nothing more than a, quote, bubble that inflates and soon dissolves. While imaginary events within real historical settings are standard fare in Scott's novels, Red Gauntlet thus goes a step further in its elision of historical fact with fantasy and its metafictional reflections on speculative storytelling, a dimension that it shares with Hogg's Justified Sinner. Hogg's Gothic psychological thriller interweaves a plethora of truth claims and evidence in the form of archival documents, handwritten confessions, and published articles, into its fantastic narrative of demonic characters and supernatural events. Both Hogg's novel and Scott's juxtapose historical truth claims with blatant fantasy, and both elide the boundary between fact and fiction to the extent that they could be said to perpetuate a hoax or even a fraud on their readers. To return to the homology between literature and economic behavior, the belief-based speculations of the financial market and speculation-based narrative as a literary form both court credibility with readers or investors by projecting scenarios that are vulnerable to exposure as paper fictions. Overall, speculation thus appears in Scottish literature of this period in the form of plot elements that reference real-world events, but also as metaphor and mode, generating a form of speculative fiction that lures readers into a tangle of evidence-based reality and imaginative projection while blurring the boundary between them. Financial speculation in Britain during the 1820s was also a form of global entanglement, given that colonial projects such as mining and canal schemes and loans to South and Central American republics were among the era's most popular and eventually most catastrophic investment vehicles. Transatlantic investment intersected with a marked increase in emigration from Scotland beginning in the 1820s. Historians have identified a number of factors for this development, including the displacement of agricultural tenants and tacksmen due to the Highland clearances, post-Napoleonic unemployment due to the return of discharged soldiers, as well as grain shortages and high food prices. In 1819 to 1820, local uprisings contributed to a change of attitude and policy as government and private interests began to regard emigration as a means of dealing with political unrest at home. The 1820s accordingly saw several state-sponsored and privately sponsored schemes to assist emigrants in relocating to the British colonies in the Americas, which had the dual benefit of removing discontented groups of the poor and unemployed from Britain and directing them to where they would strengthen the British Empire rather than the United States. Exactly 200 years ago, speculation and emigration became entangled in the Poise venture, an event that impacted Scottish life and literature from the early 1820s onward. Poise was both a colonial settlement project and the most notorious of contemporary scandals. And it was promoted in a way that exemplifies the elision of financial speculation with literary and imaginative speculation. The author of Poise was Gregor MacGregor, an adventurer from Edinburgh who claimed descent from Rob Roy MacGregor, the Highland hero whose name was conveniently on everyone's lips in the wake of Scott's 1817 novel, Rob Roy. Having made his own name as a military leader in the Venezuelan and Colombian Wars of Independence, MacGregor received a nominal land grant in Central America from a Native American chief in 1820. Although the grant was soon revoked, if it was ever valid at all, MacGregor capitalized on it as the basis for a nation he called Poye, located on the Mosquito Coast of present-day Honduras and Nicaragua, an area in which Britain had pursued colonial interests in the previous century. MacGregor raised hundreds of thousands of pounds from British speculators to colonize Poye, showing his versatility in appealing to every possible source of investment. He also proposed a, quote, Hebrew colony of Jewish settlers to be recruited from Germany and Poland in an attempt to secure financial backing from Nathan Rothschild. The pitch to Rothschild failed, and the 4 boatloads of emigrants who set sail for Poye in 1822 and 1823 were mainly from Scotland. They had been led to expect a fully fledged settlement with a capital city called St. Joseph, containing churches, a banking house, a theater, and 15,000 to 20,000 people, as well as a welcoming harbor, an idyllic climate, fruitful soil, and natives particularly friendly to the British. Yet the town of St. Joseph did not actually exist, nor did Poye exist as a country or a settlement. MacGregor was able to literally put Poye on the map of Central America. The problem is that he put it only on the map, without any correspondence in reality. The adventure ended tragically for nearly 200 would-be settlers who died in the wilderness of fever and exposure, as well as for investors who were left holding worthless paper bonds. Literature was enlisted in this case to attract settlers to Poye, with poems, songs, handbills, and a 355-page guide for emigrants entitled Sketch of the Mosquito Shore, including the territory of Poye, which was published in 1822 by the prominent Edinburgh firm of William Blackwood. Appearing under the name Thomas Strangeways, but widely suspected to be the work of MacGregor himself, this book begins with a double truth claim, citing both eyewitness evidence and published authorities. The author avows that he has proceeded by, quote, combining the knowledge which he acquired during a portion of his life spent in that part of the world, with the information afforded to him by the few but authentic authors who have written anything on the subject, and that he has, quote, confined himself as much as possible to such plain and positive facts as are established beyond the shadow of doubt by reference to the authorities alluded to, end quote. This is a prominent yet oddly qualified truth claim, not only because of the hedging phrase, as much as possible, but also because of the vagueness of the author's assertion that he has lived in that part of the world. Nevertheless, in form and content, Sketch of the Mosquito Shore blended seamlessly into the marketplace of the 1820s, which abounded with similar literature of travel and emigration. Genres of emigration literature including guidebooks, so-called booster ballads extolling the settler colony, and sentimental lyrics of farewell to the home country provided abundant opportunities to give textual presence to a new settlement venture. A poem entitled The Poise Emigrant, penned by the Edinburgh poet Joanna Belfridge Picken, who will come back into this story later, seeks to lure listeners to Poise by giving new words to a song associated with Robert Burns. The song is O'er the Moor Among the Heather. The poem constructs Poise as a, quote, fairyland of wealth and joy, of smiling vales and citron groves, whose, quote, fairer lands and brighter skies will leave no cause to sigh for the highland heather left behind. The lyric makes Poise still more attractive through its erotic evocation of a successful wooing, where the bonny lad and lassie come together and emigrate together by saying yes to Poise. The motif of going thegither is repeated twice in the chorus that follows every verse. The formal properties of a chorus as a joining in of multiple voices, itself reinforcing the theme of togetherness. Emigration, according to this poem, involves exchanging a landscape of highland heather for a more prosperous and fruitful terrain. Promising sugarcane and orange trees, the Poise Emigrant suggests that Poise will provide first-hand access to goods that are available to residents of Britain only through trade. But it also intimates that the tropical landscape will generate upgraded versions of domestic English species, such as roses. The attraction of the unseen Poise is thus not so much that it's different from home, but that it is much the same, except that exotic luxuries will be ripe for the picking. Moreover, the undisruptive exchange of sugar and oranges for highland heather is reinforced by the substitution of new content within the familiar genre and rhythm of a traditional Strathspey tune. Projecting the colony as an enhanced version of home is an understandable selling tactic, but one that ironically foreshadows a common reason for the failure of settlement ventures. That is, the unrealized expectation that the destination country will be a lot like the home country, only better and more productive. Yet even after the Poise bubble burst, it proved difficult to distinguish reality from fantasy and truth from fraud. Victims of the disastrous speculation and survivors of the appalling experience on the Mosquito Coast came forward and claimed to have been misled by fallacious texts used by the public press. One survivor whose exposé appeared in the Edinburgh Annual Register declared in Shakespearean language that, quote, there is no Poise sea or city of Poise in existence, and that, quote, the whole scheme of the establishment has been built upon the baseless fabric of a vision, end quote. As the failure of the Poise speculation played itself out in newspapers, pamphlets, and courtroom trials during the mid-1820s, inquiries into the truth of MacGregor's claims focused interestingly on textual issues, that is, on questions of authorship, plagiarism, narrative perspective, and the credibility of printed texts. In the course of one lawsuit, the Court of King's Bench questioned the authorship, and for that matter, the literary merit, of advertisements that lured, quote, deluded speculators to Poise, including the Poise Emigrant poem and the guidebook Sketch of the Mosquito Shore. Claimants argued that the book wasn't based on eyewitness testimony at all, and that it didn't just imitate, but instead plagiarized existing travel literature, such as Patrick Brown's History of Jamaica and Brian Edwards' History of the British Colonies in the West Indies. Despite these charges, Gregor MacGregor was never convicted of fraud, And he continued to sell Poye bonds and land well into the 1830s. Historical evidence suggests that the Poye venture gained so much uptake and persisted through so many revivals because it looked so much like legitimate emigration projects. While the financial crisis of 2007 to 8 brought modern attention to the Poye affair as one of the most elaborate of historical financial scandals, it also generated revisionary assessments by historian Matthew Brown and literary scholar Kit Nichols, among others, who suggest that Poye was less an out-and-out fraud and more of a piece with the speculative economy of the 1820s than has usually been thought. Given the blending of fact and fiction in the literary and financial marketplace, both these interpretations are valid, and indeed, they're interdependent. A hoax on the scale of Poye was enabled by the speculative economy and the print culture of the 1820s, specifically by the existence of genres in which fact extended seamlessly into fantasy and print media themselves constituted a source of authority. Familiar literary genres could also be used to process disappointment and failure. After the implosion of the Poye scheme, the booster ballad entitled The Poye Emigrant was answered by an elegiac lyric that deliberately echoed its title but inverted its theme. While the booster ballad encouraged emigrants not to sigh for Highland heather, the lyric of regret is an extended sigh for the home they have left behind. According to the Poye emigrant's lamentation, the, quote, pleasure and wealth that were promised have proven to be, quote, charms they employed to bewitch us. The supposedly friendly foreign landscapes have been exposed as deadly deserts. Deliberate forgetting of the homeland has been turned into the inability to forget. Quote, dear Scotia, farewell, we'll remember thee still. And the message of the poem is now, whatever you do, do not emigrate. Quote, oh, ne'er leave your vale or the home of your fathers. Another longer poem that appeared in the Scots magazine in the aftermath of Poye, entitled Poye Eclogue, uses iambic pentameter and allusions to Paradise Lost to express regret and bitterness about the Poye deception. Beginning with a pregnant allusion to Darien, the eclogue shows 4 hapless emigrants languishing on the barren shore of Poye and lamenting their vulnerability to the temptations of Gregor MacGregor, who is figured here as the enemy of humankind. Quote, like Satan seeking whom he might devour, MacGregor met me in an evil hour, end quote. All these texts about Poye, from Sketch of the Mosquito Shore and booster ballads such as The Poye Emigrant, to poems of lamentation and regret, all have in common their strong dependence on existing models to render the unfamiliar in terms of the familiar. Guides for emigrants, traditional songs, long-established genres such as ballad and eclogue, and even Miltonic epic. Scholars such as Lara Atkin have recently called attention to the way emigration poetry circulated in the material form of newspapers and anthologies, quote, in the same trans-imperial networks of commodity exchange that enabled other portable goods to circulate between Europe and the colonies, end quote. Texts circulated, as did goods, and people, emigrants, displaced people, and enslaved people. Yet the term circulation may suggest a greater regularity of movement than is warranted. Influenced by the speculative spirit of the age as well as by accident and contingency, emigration often looks more like migration, and the process of settlement is notoriously unsettled. As Faria Sheikh points out, quote, emigrants rarely settled down immediately once they had arrived in their new destinations, end quote. More than that, their destinations sometimes pivoted radically from one part of the Americas to another. A compelling example is the transatlantic entanglements of Joanna Belfridge Picken, author of The Poise Emigrant, and her brother, Andrew Belfridge Picken. Andrew, also a poet, also wrote verses to advertise the Poise scheme before he himself embarked as a Poise colonist. Being one of the lucky survivors, though financially ruined, he returned to Edinburgh and eked out a living as a writer. In 1830, he emigrated to a more realistic destination, Montreal, where he was later joined by his sister Joanna, and they taught art and music respectively while both continued their writing careers. With his crisscrossing of the Atlantic from Edinburgh to the putative Poise, back to Edinburgh, and then to Lower Canada, Andrew Belfridge Picken exemplifies the transatlantic displacements of the era. Confusingly, so does a second writer, also named Andrew Picken, this one from the west of Scotland, who had undertaken failed business ventures in Dublin and Jamaica before moving to London and writing a travel guide about Canada. Although this second Andrew Picken had never been to Canada, he based his guidebook on information provided by his acquaintance John Galt, an understudied participant in and narrator of 19th century emigration projects who, as Matthew Wickman has written, self-consciously addresses the paradox of Romantic-era Scotland as, quote, the epitome of a constitutionally unsettled and self-undoing globality, end quote. John Galt was inherently a speculator, both in his business ventures and in his immensely prolific fiction writing. His background and experience are full of transatlantic entanglements. A branch of his family had emigrated to Virginia in the 17th century. His father was a ship's captain involved in West Indian trade. His brother James died in Montego Bay, Jamaica in 1798. His remaining brother, Tom, who traveled to Honduras as part of a mercantile enterprise, died there in 1813, uncannily close to the place where the Poise settlers arrived and perished a decade later. John Galt himself, in his mercantile career, worked with Glasgow and London firms on shipping ventures to Jamaica and the Spanish-American colonies before Canadian concerns became the focus of his attention. Galt's work as an agent for the Canadian residents seeking reparations after the War of 1812 led on to his founding of the Canada Company that supported settlement in Upper Canada and to his own residence and travels in North America during the 1820s. Even the regional fiction of the west of Scotland, for which Galt has remained best known, is distinctively interwoven with global cross-currents. Several critics, including Katie Trumpner, Kenneth McNeil, Matthew Wickman, and Franco Moretti, have explored the innovative ways in which his Annals of the Parish of 1821 maintains a tight geographic compass in the West Country parish of Dalmailing, and yet registers the effect of world events such as the American Revolution, Napoleon's campaigns, and transatlantic trade. Galt wrote extensive non-fictional essays on political economy, international commerce, colonization, and slavery. And these concerns are reflected in his distinctive style of fictional writing about his Scottish home. As Anthony Gerrels puts it, quote, in his tales and novels, Galt developed a set of formal strategies for highlighting the interplay between the bounded space of locale and the unboundedness that resulted from global economic flows. End quote. Global entanglements come home to Galt in a different way once he begins traveling to North America himself in 1825 and brings that experience into his writing. His descriptions of Canada regularly draw comparisons with other geographies, including his previous travels in the Mediterranean, and even though he had not been there himself, Central America. In particular, he represents his founding of the town of Guelph in Upper Canada, which he regarded as one of his life's achievements, by likening it to William Patterson's founding of the Darien colony some 130 years earlier. Galt maintained a decades-long fascination with Patterson, the 17th century Scottish entrepreneur who founded the banks of England and Scotland and dreamed up the Darien project. Galt worked on a biography of Patterson from 1823 until the very end of his life in 1839. Besides reflecting Galt's extensive research on Central America and the Caribbean, his committed work on the Patterson biography shows how much he identified with Patterson as a projector of grand ideas. At the point in the narrative where Patterson arrives in Central America and begins to found the Darien settlement, Galt interjects an intense personal recollection. Quote, "It is not allowed to many men to conceive the feelings which Patterson probably experienced when the foundations of New Edinburgh were laid, but in the various life of his present biographer, an event of a similar kind has taught him to comprehend them. I can never forget the bright phantasm that shone around myself when I laid the axe to the root of the first tree felled in preparation for the site of Guelph, an instant radiant with ages." End quote. Identifying the founding of Guelph with the founding of Darien seems an ill omen, but Galt evidently hoped that in some way his bright phantasm of Guelph would redeem and compensate for the Darien disaster. Gregor MacGregor seems to have had the same hopes for Poise, given that he too made allusions to Darien and claimed descent from those who participated in the expedition. Curiously, to me, John Galt never mentions MacGregor or Poise in his writings, despite his intense interest in speculation and emigration, his connections to Central America, and the fact that the ships bound for Poise sailed from the exact locations where Galt spent the early 1820s, Greenock, Edinburgh, and London. Galt could not, however, ignore another contemporary counterpart to Darien and Poise. That is the experience of the hapless Scottish families who tried to emigrate to La Guaira on the coast of modern-day Venezuela. In 1822, the same year as Sketch of the Mosquito Shore, including the territory of Poise, another guide for emigrants appeared, this one describing a destination on the southern rather than the western shore of the Caribbean, that is Alexander Walker's Colombia. The recent struggles for independence in Colombia, where British officers, including Gregor MacGregor, had played a part, and the speculative climate of the 1820s, in which South American government bonds and resource extraction projects figured prominently, all of this provided a context for settlement schemes such as the one at La Guaira near Caracas, Venezuela. It was organized by a British company known as the Colombian Agricultural Association that had acquired large tracts of land from the government of Gran Colombia, and that commissioned Alexander Walker to write about the territory as a destination for investment and emigration. Similarly to Galt's Canada Company, the Colombian Association intended to carry out improvements on the land and sell or lease it to British and European settlers. To this end, the company recruited 30 families of immigrants from the Highlands and Northeast Scotland. These prospective La Guairans were offered free passage to Venezuela, accommodation in barracks on arrival, supplies for an initial period, and land that they would settle and work in order to pay back its sale price within a set period. 191 emigrants, fully half of them children under the age of 14, embarked from Cromarty, Scotland on the 1st of October 1825. Although they found on arrival that there was more reality to La Guaira than there was to Poise, the climate was better, and the settlement scheme had been planned more responsibly, if still very hastily, the project failed. Due to a delay of several months in the allocation of farmland, mismanagement and infighting among the proprietors of the land company, and inadequate awareness of how different the climate, crops, and farming methods would be in South America, the emigrants soon found themselves in a miserable and destitute condition. They petitioned the British government for assistance, alleging that they had been, quote, allured, deceived, and deserted in foreign lands, end quote. Their recriminations echo those made by the would-be colonists of Poise. The fact that Poise was largely fantasy and La Guaira an actual but ineffective colony made surprisingly little difference in the rhetoric and the suffering that resulted. Although small, the La Guaira settlement attracted the attention of high-profile figures such as the Quaker educator Joseph Lancaster and the revolutionary hero Simón Bolívar, who provided some assistance in the form of charity and publicity. Resettling the destitute emigrants in another British colony seemed the only solution, but in the end it was through chance meetings, coincidental family relationships, and misinterpreted communications between British government representatives and colonial agents, indeed through what one historian calls bureaucratic mistakes, that the Scottish settlers of La Guaira were finally dealt with by literally depositing them on the doorstep of John Galt in Upper Canada. In the late summer and fall of 1827, 135 of the twice displaced Scots arrived at Guelph, the town that Galt had founded in the Canadian forest a few months earlier. In copious correspondence about the events and later in his autobiography, Galt pleads that he could in charity do nothing with these penniless, exhausted, and ill families of Scots who had arrived just in time for a Canadian winter than to try and settle them as quickly as possible on Canada Company land. For Galt himself, who was already at odds with the colonial government and the directors of the Canada Company, disagreements and miscommunication about the financial management and decision-making process surrounding this event precipitated his dismissal from office and his recall to England. For the La Guairan Scots, going from the frying pan into, as it were, the Canadian freezer was a difficult resettlement. Yet they were ultimately successful in establishing themselves in this displaced destination, becoming part of the fabric of the brand new town of Guelph. Nevertheless, the La Guaira episode underlines the speculative, hasty, experimental, and contingent nature of early 19th century settlement enterprises, even ones that count as assisted emigration schemes. Emigration was not only a dialectic of familiar home and unfamiliar colony, but of multiple unknown unknowns, and sometimes of destinations so unfamiliar that they couldn't be made into a home at all. While Galt, no stranger to restless and extensive travels, did not have personal experience of Central America, tragic versions of a circumatlantic cycle kept impinging on him. His two brothers' deaths in the Caribbean, his own failed business ventures in that part of the world, the spectral presence of Darien in his biography of Patterson and his novel The Entail, most consequentially, the displaced settlers from La Guaira in Venezuela. It's no wonder that the novel that draws most extensively on Galt's Canadian experiences is a thoroughly circum-Atlantic text. Published in 1831, Bogle Corbett, or The Emigrants, brings in Galt's own experience of the founding of Guelph and weaves these events into a Caribbean context. The fictional narrator, Bogle Corbett, is born in Jamaica and undergoes a traumatic displacement from there to Scotland after being orphaned at an early age. Going into the West Indian mercantile business, he makes a voyage back to Jamaica in the second of the novel's 3 volumes, only to find that his birth home has become unheimlich, uncanny, due to the effects of slavery, racism, and economic distress. Bogle is a melancholy and restless traveler who circulates between the Caribbean, Britain, and Upper Canada, and within Britain between Glasgow, London, and the Highlands. The novel's epigraph from Thomas Gray's poem, The Bard, promising truth severe by fairy fiction dressed, foreshadows the blurring of boundaries between fiction and real life throughout the book. Some episodes, like Bogle Corbett's bankruptcies and his founding of a town in the Canadian forest, mirror Galt's autobiography very closely. Others are pure imaginative projection. After a notably inconclusive ending to the plot, the narrative abruptly gives way to an appendix consisting of a statistical account of physical geography in the Upper Canada townships. And what I'm showing you here is, I don't know how much you can see this, but this is the ending of the novel, the ending of the actual narrative. And then right away it's followed by this appendix signed by the initials JG for John Galt. And it continues with this statistical point form list of soil conditions and amenities in the townships of Upper Canada. This hybridization of the novel with a scientific gazette is in one sense an accident of publishing history. Galt was not a natural writer of triple-decker novels, and he often needed to add miscellaneous content to bring the 3rd volume to the requisite length. But it also reflects his determination to include truth severe for the information of prospective settlers. In effect, to make the novel into a more accurate and reliable emigrant guide than many publications that purported to convey non-fictional eyewitness truth. In Bogle Corbett, history haunts speculation in a manner that Katie Trumpner describes in terms of repetition compulsions and Ken McNeill calls, quote, a time consciousness that is simultaneously speculative and spectral, end quote. The spectral is encoded in Bogle's unpropitious first name, Scots for ghost or scarecrow, but so is the geographical, since Bogle is, by accident or design, an anagram of globe. Bogle's narrative about his unsuccessful business ventures in Glasgow and London, his voyage to the land of his birth, Jamaica, and his subsequent emigration to Canada generally lacks plot direction. Instead, it is loaded with accidents that interfere both with the novelist's plotting and the protagonist's planning. Accident and accidental are intrusive terms occurring 70 times in the course of the novel. Bogle introduces his autobiography as a history of, quote, the moving accidents which checkered my fortune, end quote. And he admits that both his life and his narrative manifest inexplicable causality. Quote, the course of my biography is like the character of my life, somewhat desultory, and the events seem to arise from causes apparently inadequate to their consequences, end quote. As accidents proliferate, some of them lead to important life decisions, and others lead nowhere at all. Bogle's injury in a carriage accident is the direct cause of his meeting with the woman who will become his second wife. His decision to emigrate follows on an accident whereby a careless servant burns down the family home. By contrast, when Bogle lands in Jamaica, the ship runs aground, and on his arrival in Canada, a terrible storm at sea causes a nearby ship to be wrecked. But these spectacular mishaps have no further outcome at all, as if they had made their way into the plot only by accident. Ian Duncan, noting the prominence of the accidental in other novels by Galt, comments that accident is both, quote, the most threatening aspect of the change that constitutes history and, quote, the narrative mode of everyday, of common life, the empirical material domain of here and now, everyday circumstance, the medium in which life goes on, end quote. In Bogle Corbett, the accidental is also the mode in which settlement takes place and books get written. In Bogle's Canadian settlement, the specific location of which is, not surprisingly, accidental, incredible chance meetings take place between characters who knew one another in Britain or who unexpectedly turn out to be related to one another. These plot motifs read like cliches of the romance genre, yet they are also, bizarrely, a realistic reflection of everyday circumstance, of the way life goes on in a new settlement, as evidenced by the way chance meetings and coincidences brought real-life emigrants from Scotland via La Guaira and New York to reunite in some cases with relatives in Upper Canada. Near the end of the novel, the mysterious emigrant Colonel Jocelyn and Bogle Corbett both reveal for the first time that they are engaged in writing their memoirs. Bogle's autobiography being the novel Bogle Corbett itself, and Jocelyn's autobiography being about to take an unexpected turn since his true identity as heir to an English fortune has just been discovered. Because Jocelyn must travel to England immediately to make good his claim, Bogle must immediately put an end to his memoir so that Jocelyn can carry the manuscript back to England for publication, as Bogle's practical wife realizes when she commands him to, quote, finish your book, Bogle, outright. With this abrupt conclusion, Bogle Corbett's text submits to the material exigencies of transatlantic writing. His physical manuscript must continue the transatlantic circuit back to Britain in order to become the novel Bogle Corbett, just as Colonel Jocelyn must transport himself back to England in order to claim his identity, his inheritance, and his English bride. The pragmatic logistics of transatlantic transportation and print culture are called on to serve the expectations of genre by enabling the publication of the 3-volume novel and the fulfillment of the romance plot. I'll end with this visual representation of transatlantic entanglements, a map on which I've sketched the parallel and intersecting, retrograde and meandering movements of most of the various figures and groups I've discussed today. I've been arguing that 19th century Scottish writing employs the norms of genre to give credibility to speculation and to work through accident and displacement, as with the use of the emigrant guide genre to promote settlement in Upper Canada, Colombia, and the more aspirational Poye, the adaptation of poetic forms to express the disappointments of the Poye settlers, and Galt's use of the 3-volume novel to stage complex circumatlantic movements. New, unfamiliar places are read in terms of home or of other places previously encountered. New speculations are both inspired and haunted by earlier ones, especially by the historical memory of Darien. But attempts to motivate, explain, and perhaps gain control over the unfamiliar only work to a limited extent, as contingencies and entanglements complicate the relationship of home and colony. Galt's narratives are a key example of early 19th century writing about the emigrant experience in the way they simultaneously reflect, analyze, and perform speculative and accidental forms of agency. The metafictional open-endedness of his novel Bogle Corbett, I would suggest, illustrates that the complex experience of the transatlantic space cannot be contained by genre, but finds expression in the almost postmodern entanglement of facticity, imagination, projection, and accident that I have been describing as early 19th century speculative fiction. Thank you.
Great many thanks, Angela, for this fascinating lecture. We have ample time for questions and answers, and there are 2 mics, or our student assistants with 2 mics. So please, before you speak, wait for the mic, right? Just put up your hand and ask your questions. Okay?
Just sit.
Well, I think that there are many topics in this lecture, and the connection between, I would say, history and fiction, for instance, is surprising, right? The way it changes our view of the 19th century novel is also very surprising. So I hope that there will be some questions, not only on John Galt, I hope.
Thanks for that really interesting talk, Angela. I was thinking about colonies and speculations on the other side of the Atlantic, namely the South African Cape and Thomas Pringle and that group of Scots that also ended up getting kind of shunted around, and how that was connected very much to changing ideas back at home in Britain about slavery and the slave trade and speculations that were associated with the slave trade. This is a very random question, I should say. Did the imaginary colony of Poise did it use slave labor? Was in that giant sketch of the Mosquito Coast, was that mentioned at all?
No. No, it wasn't. That's a very interesting question. But everything I've read about Poye, no, it wasn't, which is I hadn't thought about before, but is interesting. And the connection with Thomas Pringle and the Cape Colony is certainly that's a real that's a real and important parallel that I certainly kept coming across when researching this paper. I thought there was more than enough to talk about in the transatlantic space, but that is, that's an important parallel that does impinge actually on the novel Bogle Corbett, because it's mostly concerned with movements across the Atlantic, but there are more minor ways in which both the Cape Colony and British India impinge on the plot. Thanks for mentioning that.
Further questions, please? Yes?
Thanks. I was wondering how much of the sort of move from the early part of the talk where you were speaking about Poye in the terms of, use the word like fraud and scandal, towards the last mention, which was the aspirational Poye. How much of that is a sort of a historical argument in the sense that, some of the work I'm interested in on Scots miscellany of the Scottish border defends his inclusion of his own potential inventions into it in a few places by suggesting that the sort of anthropological standards were later developed and that he was part of an earlier moment where the invention was sort of more acceptable and done by all of his contemporaries as well. which is the sort of what you were referring to by naming a few critics when you mentioned the 21st century financial crisis.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering how much of that shift from fraud and scandal to aspiration is a product of just a shifting standard for truth, or is there another component to the argument that I'm missing?
Yeah, you mean a shifting standard on the part of critics?
Sure, yeah. I mean, but also in terms of the way in which fictions were received in the Romantic period versus how they're received today, right?
Yeah.
Our definitions of forgery and fraud have changed dramatically in those years.
as have our definitions of plagiarism, actually, which is not unconnected. I think that's a really good point, both in terms of the interpretation of an event like Poise and the actual perpetuating of it, the interpretation, because that's why I mentioned the fact that this episode in history, Poise, came back into prominence in conjunction with the financial scandals of 2007 to 8, and there were clear revisionary points of view brought forward then by both historians and literary scholars that I wasn't finding in any of the previous literature on Poise from 1823, which is when the first bad news came back. The colonists were still going out in 1823 because the news hadn't got back yet, but that was also when the first of the bedraggled survivors were coming back. So from that point onward to, I would say, the early 21st century, you only read about Poise as described as a fraud and a scandal. But now there are these revisionary interpretations that say that, well, you have to look at the context and you have to look at the way that even legitimate immigration schemes were being described, and it's not black and white. It's a more gradual scale. But the other part of what you're asking is maybe even the more interesting question is, is the standard of truth different in the 1820s? And well, yes, it may be. It sounds like a very philosophical question, and one could think about it in various frames of reference. But I think that's a large part of what I was suggesting, that this illusion of truth and fiction that I'm finding, especially in 1820s literature, because that's what I've been concentrating on for a while, that it was just normal and accepted, and it's also an illusion between genres that, or even media that are generally assumed to be non-fictional, like newspapers or documentary or non-fictional descriptions of a destination, and then on the other hand, genres that are presumed to be primarily fictional. But again, it's not one extreme or the other. There's a real gradation or meeting of the two of them in the middle of the scale.
This is not an area I know very much about or have worked on, so if my reaction is a naive one, I have to apologise to your very, very fascinating discussion. Listening, I find that I immediately want to hear another kind of fiction, which is the fiction of the people who were there and saw these colonists arrive. And it gives me the idea that somehow there's a fantasy of these places, the target of the colonisation, as somehow empty, unpeopled, an area where there is no one, or where the people there can be ignored. And imaginatively, that links for me to our current perception of the Scottish Highlands as an empty place, an uninhabited paradise, and very inviting for that reason in terms of holiday and visiting, because there is nobody there, it seems, and maybe there never was anybody there.
Yeah. With the destinations I was talking about, it's certainly an important question. Let me start with the places where there already were people, indigenous people. That's certainly the case with Guelph in Upper Canada, and in general the region where I live, southwestern Ontario, and that's a very, very important and intensively studied topic these days. What is the response of the people who were there? So it's something that one is just. One can't help but be very aware of researching the. Nothing that was absolutely directly relevant to what I was talking about today that I know of. But then there is a lot being. A lot of material being rediscovered today. I mean, this field of research is changing. I want to say weekly, but very, very quickly. So no doubt there is material that I'm not aware of. In the case of Poise, the very local problem was that, according to all the accounts by the Scottish would-be settlers, there really was no one there. Actually, no, that's not quite true. The ones there certainly were no other settlers there. They write about there are these repeated reports by different individuals among the colonists, so that they found two people. There were these two Americans there who had somehow ended up in Central, U.S. Americans who had ended up in Central America. And that was all the people that they found. But that's not true either. That's also an elision of Indigenous people, because then there are other dimensions of these narratives where it turns out that even those who survived would not have survived had it not been for the help of Indigenous people.
Yes, further questions, please. Yes, please.
Sorry, this is a fascinating paper, and I think we're giving you really tough questions. And I think there's another one. Is there a moral dimension to the speculations in these fictions? Because you've been talking about the economic dimensions, the treatment of truth, treatment of history, but not the exploration of how we deal with other human beings more generally, or what right or wrong is. And so the truth factor comes in, but not what we do with the truth factor, what we do, whether it is good or evil. Was this part of the mindset? I'm partly thinking back to Hogg, who you mentioned in one of the early slides, because that is a novel largely about how we deal with other people, or how we can trust historical accounts of how you deal with other people. Is it moral in any way, or amoral?
It's the moral factor. Morality is certainly a factor. I'm just puzzling over when you say amoral. Do you mean bad, or do you mean is morality not a category? Yeah. No, it certainly is a category. It wasn't. It wasn't the category that I was primarily using, because I'm thinking more from essentially a literary studies perspective, thinking about narrative perspective, rhetorical strategies and reception. But certainly, if one were either taking a different literary point of view, and looking at the more moral, societal, interpersonal aspects, whether it's a matter of fraud perpetuated by some European individuals on other European individuals, or by European speculators and settlers on Indigenous people. That's a huge factor that would be entirely worth investigating and applying to this whole question of the elision of truth with fiction in early 19th century discourse.
Okay, further questions? Yes, please, Carla. That's the mic.
Mary, do you want to go first?
Switched on? Yes. Thanks. It was a fabulous talk and I really enjoyed it very much. It's more an association of the mind thing than a question, but while you were discussing the Poise story, which is immensely fascinating and lends itself to so many possible interpretations, I thought of the Darien disaster and how much that still lingers in the Scottish imagination. It was a traumatic event and it's never left the Scottish imagination. So has anyone made a comparison or was that brought up to the attention of the readers? Was there any way in which the Poise was somehow compared to the Darien story, which are similar and different in many ways?
Yes. I think it certainly was compared. Poise and some of these other settlement ventures in the early 19th century were compared to the Darien venture very regularly. In fact, I would be interested to know from people who study other, maybe later periods of Scottish literature, if the memory of Darien is as present later on, because it's certainly very present in the early 19th century. The curious thing to me is it is brought in, that it's brought in on both sides of the question. It's perhaps not surprising that disappointed survivors or people who have been were made bankrupt, financially ruined by their investment in Poise, brought up this parallel to Darien about 130 years earlier. But to me, it's strange that so did the people who were promoting Poise. Gregor MacGregor himself brought up the Darien expedition as a positive precursor, and he claimed to be descended from people who, it's not very clear, people who went out to Darien or he doesn't actually claim to be descended from William Patterson, as far as I know. But that seems very strange to me, that the extent to which, or the regularity with which it is brought up as a positive precursor, also by John Galt.
Okay, time for the last question.
Okay, is there anyone else who'd like a burning question? I was going to ask, you keep on mentioning 2007, 2008, which is sort of the wrapping up of bad debt and selling it like a junk bond. So it was many people think it was a lot more like Milken and his bad junk bonds, whereas the bad bond sort of is invented, most people think, by a guy named John Law, the Scot, who notoriously almost destroyed the entirety of the French government with the Mississippi bond scheme, in which they said, oh, we've had all these new settlers, we're going to send them there, and the bond is selling the right to the trade that's actually granted by the French government. And so I just wonder if anyone had brought up John Law during these trials.
Oh, very interesting. No, not that I know of, not during the trials. John Galt does. Because Galt has a very strong interest in speculation and the history of speculation. It comes down on both sides of the question as well. In some ways he's in favor and he is inherently a speculator. In other ways he comments on the, or at least implicitly, on the immorality of previous speculations. So what I think of when you mention that is it does, the allusions to the Mississippi scandal investment do come into Galt's writings, but not into the aftermath of the Poise expedition that I know of.
Okay, if I can make a short footnote at the end. You know, this is very interesting because it anticipates the history of the colonization of American West. For instance, Poise is a predecessor of the so-called paper towns. And paper towns were just hoaxes to get money out of the people. They didn't exist, you know, but people were buying land there, you know, and then they couldn't even get there. So that was the first peril. And then, of course, the aspect of truth and morality. The fact is that the accompanying phenomenon of the colonization of the West is the so-called tall tale. And there are arguments, like by Harry Wonnum, that tall tale actually means the transition from the epistemological notion of truth to a pragmatic notion of truth. And pragmatic notion of truth is given by, I would say, general consent. So people agree that something is true, right? In this case, of course, fictions change their meaning, right? And some of them are very dangerously close to truth. And I am afraid we still live in such time. And sometimes it's very difficult to differentiate between hoaxes and truth.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and fake news. I mean,
there's
another connection that makes this very, very relevant to contemporary concerns. That's a wonderful continuation of these themes that I think takes us onward, and I'm really looking forward to discovering further connections as I hear all of your presentations later in this conference, and I'm looking forward to learning more about other periods of Scottish literature and history.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela, and thanks. And thanks to all who contributed to the discussion. Now, I just invite you to see the most historical part of this building, which is the Great Aula, where all the graduation ceremonies of this university take place. It's just underway to the reception rooms. So we go first to the Great Aula. You can just look at it, and then we go downstairs. We descend to the reception rooms. And of course, you are invited to join all of us at the reception.